G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Can you believe that?
The bodies of 6 civilians with gunshot wounds were found in the basement of a home outside the capital city of Kyiv. Just more evidence of war crimes and atrocities, according to the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, who earlier had spoken to CNN Fred Plotkin.
Putin defends war in Ukraine as noble. There speaks a man who clearly believes all his own bullshit. There is no other possible way anybody could say that sort of stuff and expect to be believed. Vladimir Lilli Putin, as I've seen him described in the comments threads, and I like that to the point where I'm adopting it. Vladimir Lilli Putin. A Lilliputian Putin. A little Putin. A diminutive Putin. People say that Napoleon was not a little man. Perhaps. On the other hand, Napoleon was short enough that he spent a lot of his life looking up at people who were taller than him. And it's an indisputable fact that when Napoleon embarked on his campaign to conquer Russia, he took 100,000 pairs of tall French testicles with him because he conscripted everybody in France of military age who was a man who was over 5'8". And he took his tall French testicles to Russia and he only brought back about 10,000 pairs. And the height of the average Frenchman dropped and they became a nation of little men. And there's a truism, an old wives' tale, a fable, a traditional oral history social observation to the effect that you should never frighten a little man, because if you do, later on he'll sneak up behind you and kill you. So Vladimir Lilli Putin, born 1953 in a place called Leningrad. Leningrad had a longer siege than Stalingrad, and it was about as intense as Stalingrad's siege was. A lot of people think of Stalingrad when they think of the most horrible frozen winter warfare hell in Russia or in the Soviet Union versus the Nazi Empire. Der Turd Reich, the Reich full of turds. But Leningrad was besieged for something like 4 years. And I think I recall hearing at one point there were 6,000 civilian casualties a day from starvation. If you starve a population, particularly the people who are young, they grow up to become undersized as adults and their children grow up to become undersized. Putin was conceived and born in Leningrad to a starveling mother and a father who fought in World War II. Leningrad was probably the highest concentration of PTSD shattered alcoholic traumatized Russian adults of anywhere in the Soviet Union during the 1940s and 50s and 60s when Vladimir was a kid. What can I say? If you traumatize a child, if you brutalize a child, if you neglect a child, it has certain effects on the development of their personality. Some children are what they call dandelion children, and they don't require particularly good parenting in order to do quite well. Other children are called orchid children, and they've got lots of genetic predispositions towards sensitivity, and they're generally pretty smart. And if they get a consistent, kind, loving, interactive, stimulating environment from a bunch of committed people, they can grow up to be Isaac Newton or Christopher Wren. If, on the other hand, they get beaten by an alcoholic, miserable, mongrel bastard of a cobbler, have their arm broken when they're 11, get around with an open fracture of their left elbow for 2 years until their mother gets them put into a Georgian Orthodox Russian seminary to be turned into a priest. When they're 17, they get kicked out of the seminary as being unfit for the priesthood, change their name from Joseph Jugashvili to Joseph Stalin, and they go off to become, perhaps, possibly, quite likely, the world's greatest murderer. That's what happens when you get an orchid kid, and instead of cherishing them and nourishing them and raising them to think that they want to be a nice person, you beat them and ill-treat them and teach them that the only way to survive is to suppress everybody else. I haven't read any books on it or anything. I have heard it mentioned in several YouTube videos, so therefore in this day and age it could be pure propaganda, but it kind of rings true in my understanding of what Russian or what Soviet civilization was like during the Cold War. Vladimir Putin, as a primary school age kid, used to hunt rats in the derelict building basements for sport and entertainment. And a couple of times he got a cornered rat that stood up to him, and he learned that you don't negotiate, you just continue to crush your opposition. He thrived in the Stalinist and post-Stalinist Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he was a colonel in the KGB in charge of half of bloody Poland. He liked that shit. He went from the KGB to the FSB, and then when Boris Yeltsin resigned for extreme alcoholism, he appointed Putin as a president pro tem for the time being to take you to the election. And guess who won? The KGB captured the Kremlin in 1991. But guess what? They were only copying. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, Ronald Reagan's vice president, his last job before that, he was deputy director of the CIA. He was second in charge of all the spies in America. Putin, his career only rose as high as colonel in charge of half of Poland in the KGB. But anyway, that's the personality that you've got. His ambition appears to be, seems to be, to restore a kind of a Stalinist, capitalist, corrupt, crony, oligarchical dictatorship. Excuse me. He wants to be a czar, a neo-czar. He wants to re-establish the imperial greatness of the Russian Empire, and he wants to be the imperial figure who brings it all about. He wants to reverse and avenge and revenge himself on the West for having essentially driven the Soviet Union to bankruptcy when two science fiction writers who both won Nebula Awards for their fiction, Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven, they told Ronald Reagan about what a marvelous idea it would be if you had hydrogen bombs in satellites orbiting the Earth to shoot down fleets of Russian nuclear ICBMs. Reagan said that's what a great idea. He was dementing. There was a competition between the ex-deputy director of the CIA as vice president and Reagan's wife's astrologer as to who was guiding American foreign policy and national policy and military policy with the strongest hand on the more powerful rein. Ronnie did what he was told. He gave money to the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Soviets could see that the Americans were literally spending billions of dollars. At one point, some bits of it were declared to be operational and fit for deployment, which was complete bullshit. But the Soviets figured the only possible way to deal with it would be to saturate the system with ever more missiles, with ever more warheads. At one point, the Soviet Union was spending something like 35% of total gross domestic product on its military budget. There were no razor blades in the shops. There was no soap. There was no shaving cream. Sometimes there was no shoes. The consumers couldn't put up with the austerity. Blue jeans were worth their weight in gold on the black market. 33 and a third long playing records of Western pop bands were worth their weight in gold on the Russian black market. Of course, as part of my studies on how war works and why people think it's a good idea, I paid a bit of attention to what was going on with the Soviets and the Cold War and all the rest of it. They had stores, GUM stores, where only high-ranking Communist Party members were allowed to shop, and they had Western goods. The hoi polloi, the ordinary people, the Soviet counterpart of serfs and peasants, they weren't allowed in there. They were paid in rubles. You had to have hard currency to buy in the GUM stores. There was a saying that Moscow was downhill from everywhere in Russia because all the good stuff rolled down to Moscow, and people who lived in Moscow, they lived really well. Everybody else lived like shit. In Western factories, if you can get something that's built on a Wednesday, it's the best stuff. If it's built on a Tuesday or a Thursday, it's maybe not so good because people are either hungover from the weekend or they're absent-minded thinking about the next weekend. On a Monday or a Friday, it's pretty shit because half the people don't show up for work on Monday because they're really badly overhung, and half the people don't show up for work on Friday because they're keen to run away and get to the party. That Wednesday foreman's friend kind of production sine curves, that happened in Russia, but it was on a monthly basis. In the Soviet Union, it was on a monthly basis. Every month they had a production target. At the start of the month, most of the stuff that rolled off the assembly line was incomplete because they didn't have all of the component parts because they'd used all of them in the previous month's rush period, which was the final week of the month. So during the first week of the month, everything they produced was shit. During the second and third week of the month, everything they produced was as functional as it gets because the supply of components had caught up with the production line. And then by the fourth week of the month, everything they produced was shit because they were just bolting crap together to meet the production targets. And that's kind of how the Soviet civilization operated. Well, Vladimir Lilli Putin, he liked it that way. It meant that only the children of the party members and the security services got any kind of education. Everybody else did as they were told. It was just kind of like Tsarist serfdom, only wrapped up in communism. But a whole bunch of people believed in communism, and if you've ever read Tolstoy, War and Peace, and get a bit of a head grip on the way Russian civilization worked under the Tsar, you can perfectly understand why everybody thought that Bolshevism and Menshevikism was a good set of ideas. The Mensheviks were better than the Bolsheviks because the Mensheviks wanted to have lots of committee meetings and talk everything through, and it was the Mensheviks who actually got elected. And then the Bolsheviks took over because they wanted to have guns and rob banks to finance further operations and stuff. Lenin was a Bolshevik. Actually, he was a Leninist, but he got into the Bolsheviks and he took them over, and then the Bolsheviks took over the Mensheviks. And yeah, it then got messy, particularly when Lenin died and Stalin took over. And then the Holodomor, where Stalin starved the Ukrainian kulaks, the peasant farmers, because he wanted their seed grain so that he could sell it on the foreign market to generate hard currency to buy machine tools to modernize Russia to run the factory. Yeah, he had his plan in mind. And dictators and authoritarians, they believe that the end justifies the means. Whatever end they have in mind, that justifies the means. They don't care what they have to do to get their shit done. They don't care who they have to hurt. They don't care if they have to tell absolute blatant bloody lies, because they have the opinion that the population are idiots and they will believe what they are told. And put another log on the fire. And because we live in a universe that runs on free will and consequences, perfect liberty, perfect responsibility, and because the universe is it's governed by cosmic scoreboard effect. So there's a handicapping system. So the more stupid bullshit an infant learns when they're role modeling on the adults who are feeding them and caring for them, the more bullshit they imprint at an early age. And the longer the imprinting and the role modeling and the learning and the education of the bullshit goes on, then when that infant becomes a toddler, becomes a child, becomes an adolescent, becomes a young adult, how personally responsible are they for their behavior and their actions when all of those behaviors and actions have been carried out by thought processes which have been formed by other people who are trying to have an effect on their upbringing? So cosmic scoreboard effect seems to give individuals free hits on the cosmic scoreboard for doing dumb and stupid shit because they thought it was a good idea, or someone told them it was a good idea. And you might do a stupid thing one or two or three times and get away with it with increasingly narrow escapes. And what you're supposed to learn from that experience is that this shit doesn't work. Let's not do that again. But you're also, because of free will, you are perfectly entitled to take a completely different meaning from the exercise. You can take the meaning that I can get away with this shit because I've done it before and nothing bad happened to me. You know, I have fate on my side, or I'm one of God's chosen, or I'm a superior superhuman and therefore, you know, the odds don't matter to me because I'm me. And you keep going and eventually, finally, it'll catch up with you. So if you take a little Vladimir and you make him stunted because his mother was starved, and you let him grow up chasing rats in the basement for entertainment under the Stalinist, Khrushchevian, Soviet, authoritarian, communist dictatorship, and he gets a penchant for working in the secret police and spying on people and telling half-truths, which half the truth is 100% of a lie, but telling half-truths about what he thinks he knows about what other people are thinking or are said to have said, feeding those manipulated to his own modifications up and down the chains of command. And he gravitated to the top. He is the scum that floated to the top. And his goal is to re-establish the Tsarist Empire. And he's probably smart enough to realise that global warming is actually not bullshit, you know. He can remember when a golf ball-sized hailstone was big enough to get in the national news, and now, unless they're bigger than oranges, it won't make the newspaper. I can remember maybe 7 years ago the first time I heard that 2 horses were killed by a hailstone. Bat, lump of rock, lump of ice that, as hard as a rock, falls out of the sky, hits a horse on the head, kills the horse. There was also dozens of sheep and scores of kangaroos, or maybe it was scores of sheep and dozens of kangaroos out near Narromine. Big, hardy, healthy animals that live out in the great outdoors being killed by hailstones. I think Putin is smart enough, Lilli Putin, he's smart enough to realise that the nature of reality has changed and is changing, and he's not going to be able to continue to sell oil and gas to a world that's rapidly decarbonising. He can see that the droughts and the floods and the storms are getting worse, and he wants to achieve his ends before it's too late. I'm pretty sure Winnie the Pooh in China had grand designs and plans to do the same. I'm pretty sure if Vladimir had been able to lead the victory parade through Kiev 3 days after invading, I reckon Winnie the Pooh would have gone into Taiwan by now already. I think the only thing keeping Winnie the Pooh from ordering an invasion of Taiwan while America's busy in Ukraine, the only reason he doesn't want to do it is because street fighting in Taiwan's not going to be much fun. And if you use overwhelming force to turn Taiwan into rubble, then you don't get the microchip manufacturing plant. And if you don't get the microchip manufacturing plant, you just suppress global international trade as well as your own ability to make high-tech computers. So yeah, I think the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion has snookered Winnie the Pooh. It's increasingly looking as if the fight in Ukraine is a proxy war between NATO and China. And China's backing Russia, or was backing Russia, very heavily in the first 3 or 4 days. By the end of the week, the Chinese were backtracking on everything. But initially, Chinese citizens were not told to get out of Ukraine. Chinese citizens were told, it's cool, you can stay there, you won't be at any danger. Here's how to make a Chinese flag. Put that on your car, and that'll keep you safe when, mortars and artillery shells and rockets and cruise missiles are flying around, because you've got a Chinese flag, and we're friends with Russia. Invasion happens. Chinese internet sites, Chinese social media lights up with all these patriotic nationalistic Chinamen talking about how great it is that Russia's taken over Ukraine, and this means that China's going to invade Formosa, which is what they call Taiwan. And of course the Ukrainians are better at computers than the Chinese bloggers are. So it wasn't long before all of that stuff was being shown in Ukraine. And that's when the Chinese citizens in Ukraine were being told by the Ukrainians, okay, Chinaman, you can walk up those stairs and go out that door, and you can stand out there on the street with your little bloody Chinese flag and see how you go in the streets against the Russian tanks. And all of a sudden, the Chinese living in Ukraine started coming up with a whole different view on the war. And the Chinese back in China started telling the Chinese in Ukraine, no, don't put a Chinaman flag on your car. Hide in a bunker, hide in a basement. Keep out of sight, stay low. Now, as I recall, at about the 16th of February, before the actual shooting started, I put out the video, Putin's pressing problem. Global warming, general winter has changed sides. If Putin wanted to win, he should have done it by actual surprise, and he should have done it in winter before the bloody ground thawed and turned into mud. But he was sucking up to Winnie the Pooh, so he waited till the Limp Dicks was over. Oh, the Limp Dick Games for world peace. And that meant that the early spring, because of global warming, and after a winter that was 4 degrees warmer than the long-term average, yeah, he tried to invade into a quagmire, which is why all of his military columns were stuck on the roads. Now, back then I'd barely heard of a javelin, didn't know what an NLAWS was, but I knew how the NATO sponge and hedgehog tactics were designed to cope with the Russian numerical superiority in tanks. Back in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, it was the ATGWs, anti-tank anti-tank guided wire-guided missiles, and as it flew down the range, it spooled 2 insulated single-strand wires through which the operator had flight control over the missile's elevators and rudder, and then manually flew the thing onto the target. But their tactics were to pick out the command and control vehicles and then take your time wiping out the rest of the Russians, or the rest of the Soviets. And having watched one or two videos of what the javelins were going to do, yeah, I could see how if the Ukrainians had been properly trained and if they had all the latest, greatest anti-tank missiles and anti-helicopter missiles, there's very little way the old Red Army could have bloody taken them on. Russia's army with Chinese tyres that weren't maintained, a bunch of conscripts who were told that they were going on an exercise, who didn't fill their vehicles with, well, didn't fill their vehicles' ammunition lockers with ammunition because they'd packed dress uniforms for the victory parade they were going to have in Kiev, 3 days after they crossed the border. Well, that didn't work well. So Vladimir Lilli Putin has invaded Ukraine. He's got himself bogged in a war that he cannot militarily win on the conventional battlefield. The Russian official formal published doctrine is that if they are losing a conventional war, if they're facing the collapse of their national state because they're losing a conventional war, then it's perfectly legitimate for them to move to a first strike on a nuclear level. And I just can't get it out of my head that NATO and ANZUS, because I'm in ANZUS, we never ever built any large public civilian bomb shelters, blast shelters, or fallout shelters. If you want to build yourself a fallout shelter, you know, you've got to put the development application into council, and it's a difficult job to do it legally. No town council, no suburb council, no city council in any of the NATO or ANZUS countries decided to build public shelters. It's not like World War II in Germany where the government built shelters. It's not like the Cold War in the Soviet Union where the government built large public bomb shelters and fallout shelters. ANZUS and NATO, they had shelters for the military, for the politicians, but not for the public. Public could build shelters if they wanted to, but generally everybody was told that we had such overwhelming superiority and mutually assured destruction meant the war was not going to happen. You were never going to get bombed. So why spend public money on fallout shelters when we can spend it on football stadiums? So we got football stadiums. We got no public bomb shelters. 5 years ago, it came across my news feed that apropos of nothing much in particular, the Soviets, or whoops, the Russians, were cleaning out, repairing, repainting, restocking all of their old Soviet era bomb shelters in the cities that had them, and most of their big cities have these things, making sure their air raid sirens work. I've seen motorcycle restoration videos put up by people who had just bought a government surplus air raid siren that had a V8, 250 horsepower motor running the air raid siren that used to be up on top of a building in the middle of the American cities. The Yanks don't even have the bloody warning sirens anymore. The first nuke that goes off in low Earth orbit above the excited status, the EMP will take out all of your mobile phones, most of your car ignitions, and they haven't got any old-fashioned mechanical spark ignition, magneto, battery and coil type motors to run the air raid sirens anymore. They haven't got any shelters. I strongly suspect that Vladimir Lilli Putin attacked Ukraine in a deliberate, willful attempt to goad NATO to shoot at a Russian. What he wants is somebody, anybody, any one of the 30 NATO countries, he wants somebody to shoot at the Russians. If NATO shoots at the Russians, he can then say, with a straight face, and he likes lying, but he'd prefer to have a straight face on this issue. Hark, look at that. Russians have been fired on by a nuclear-armed coalition of 30 hostile aggressor nations. There is no possible way that we can defeat NATO on a conventional battlefield because our army and navy and air force have just had the shit beaten out of them by the Ukrainians with all of the free anti-tank and anti-helicopter missiles and free battle helmets from Germany and God knows what else, plus all of NATO's military intelligence in real time. Russia can't defeat that. Now they've been attacked, gunfire, battlefield conditions apply. A state of war exists. WAAWGH bracket exclamation mark close bracket. War! The vocalization made by all primates when they're angry enough, hungry enough, or frightened enough to be prepared to kill. Even kill members of their own species. That's when the chimpanzees ripped the head off the interloper. War! Angry, frightened, hungry. And think about it from Lilli Putin's point of view. If he launches a massive, brackets, inverted commas, defensive counter force, which means you go after the enemy's missile silos and airports and submarine bases and whatever submarines that you can locate, but a counter force, massive first strike by surprise. The way it plays out is he doesn't give any warning. Somebody shoots at a Russian. He announces, boo-hoo, sob, sob, Russia has been attacked. He pushes the launch button. 30 seconds after he pushes the launch button, he pushes his air raid warning sirens. And all of Russia's metropolitan city population hears the sirens go off, and they've got 20 to 40 minutes to get under cover. NATO's population, they might get a warning on a transistor radio if they're listening to it. They might get a warning on Facebook. They might get a warning on the mobile phone network. Maybe, perhaps, maybe not. Whose population is going to be in better condition afterwards, after NATO does whatever it can by way of a retaliatory strike on Russia after NATO gets nuked by surprise? Is it going to be Putin's population of brainwashed bloody sheeples who think that a special military operation is not a war and that Russians don't attack civilians and that any time anybody in the rest of the world comes up with video evidence of dead civilians, on a satellite while the Russians were occupying the town, who were still lying in the street in the same position when the Ukrainians recaptured the town? Anybody who says that, that's all fake, it's all fake news, are they going to be in a better position to be grateful to their leader when they come out after NATO's retaliatory strike compared to NATO's population after they get nuked by surprise and they've got no fucking shelter and no air raid siren to tell them to get into the shelter they haven't got? Who gets to win a nuke you later atomic mushroom skyscape decorating competition? I don't think it's going to be NATO. I'm pretty sure NATO's got enough submarine-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles with MIRV warheads that it won't be the Russians who are in good shape either, because if the Russian nukes work as well as their fucking tanks work and their armoured personnel carriers and their trucks, if their nukes are like that, maybe only 10% of them will actually get out of the silos. And out of those, maybe only 30% will get where they're going, and out of those, maybe only half of them will actually go bang, and the other half will probably fizzle. So they'll just spread plutonium dust all over the place like a big dirty bomb. Whereas NATO's nukes, they actually work. They will have been maintained by people driven by overcompensated inferiority complexes and paranoid persecution complexes, the sort of person who really likes marching up and down in neat straight lines with shiny, shiny shoes, saluting and saying, sir, yes, sir. They will have been maintaining NATO's nukes just fine. The people who've been maintaining Putin's nukes, they've all got multi-million-dollar luxury speedboats in Monte Carlo. How good are the nukes going to work when he actually fires them? Don't know. Really don't know. But at this point in the game, if Russia and NATO nuke each other, then world trade collapses. COVID didn't actually shut anything down to the point where it couldn't more or less reboot, but there's not much fat left in the system for rebuilding. And when your towns are getting flooded twice a month apart, record-breaking floods, 20% higher than any flood ever happened before, like what happened in Lismore, February and March. How long is the economy going to be able to sustain $44,000 to fire an in-law at a Russian tank? Australia sent $70 million in electronic funds as a cheque from the Australian government to NATO with the instruction that you fellas should buy a whole lot of anti-tank missiles with this Australian money and give it all to the Ukrainians. There's something to carry all that anti-tank weaponry around that we're buying. And Mr. Zelensky got on his Zoom box and he talked to the Australian Parliament and he said, can we have some Bushmasters, please? And ScoMo's in election mode, so of course you can have some Bushmasters, mate. We will fucking fly them to you in C-17 cargo planes. So a couple of days ago, 4 Bushmasters were freshly resprayed in Ukrainian colours, one of them with a big prominent red cross on the side of it, put in a C-17 and dispatched to go to Ukraine. We're going to send another 16 of them as well. They're a 4-wheel drive battle taxi that weighs 12 tonnes, and everybody wants them because when Australia was trying to occupy Iraq and Absurdistan, when they drove over booby traps, which is what fragile people with fragile egos don't like calling them booby traps, they call them IEDs, improvised explosive devices, because that makes the people who built them sound like they're fucking poor people, peasants, dirt farmers. They've got no proper factories to make a serious bloody explosive device. They have to improvise. When the Australian Bushmasters drive over the booby traps, none of the boobies died. Bang! And the V-shaped armoured underside with all of the shock-absorbing technology, yeah, the boobies got to sit in the Bushmasters and they did not die. Frightened shit out of them. They all come home with PTSD and concussion and neuropsychiatric brain injuries, but they didn't die. Right? So, yeah, the Ukrainians want them. See what I mean? NATO is fighting China and Russia and Ukraine are the proxies. The propeller's slowing down. There. Raw heat, electricity, Peltier effect, thermoelectrics. Isn't it great? So anyway, at this point in the game, all the ostensible reasons for staging, holding, conducting this war in Ukraine, they only sort of have to make sense to the people who are on the spot. To the Russians, to the conscripts, by this stage, I'm sure they hate every Ukrainian they see because they know they are getting massacred. They've probably got very little trust and respect for their own chain of command, but they hate every Ukrainian they see because it's the Ukrainians who are brewing up their comrades in arms. And nobody fights a war for patriotism. Nobody fights a war for the flag or the national capital, or even really the family back home. People fight wars so they do not see themselves let down their comrades in arms, the people they trained with. So after you brew up, say, 30% of the tanks in a column of tanks, The 70% of the tankers who do not get cooked to death in 5 minutes of fiery horror, they don't come out of it, all of them not wanting to fight. Some of them do. Some of them, they decide that's it, the time has come to find a lull in festivities and head for the bloody horizon and surrender. But the ones who pride themselves on sticking the course, what they do is they get viciously hard. They figure that their survival is going to depend on overwhelming firepower and killing every perceived threat that even looks like sticking its head up. If they have to machine gun 30 kids on push bikes to make sure that not one of them cycles past their foxhole and drops a grenade down their bloody back, that's what they will do. So the Russians are not going to back off from their campaign of viciousness. It's been educated and bred into them by their system. Their army doesn't have a strong cadre or corps or backbone of sergeants and warrant officers. What they have is mindless fucking cannon fodder, and they have officers who are in it for the career, but they're all corrupt because they don't get paid enough. And promotion is all based on political loyalty, political reliability. Unless you're the sort of person who can say that a black square is actually a white circle, because black and white, square and circle, they're words, and words are symbols, and symbols have variable meanings, and given sufficient understanding and sufficient understanding of the population concerned, and given sufficient repetition, it's perfectly possible to convince the majority of the population, an effective functional majority, that a black circle is a white square, because square and circle, black and white, they're symbols. Symbols have variable meanings. The fact that Joseph Goebbels said it does not mean that Vladimir Putin, Lilli Putin, isn't trying to apply that principle. And yeah, I think he's going to nuke NATO. And when anybody decides to nuke NATO, one of their very high priority first off targets is maybe 2 missiles with 2 5 warhead MIRVs at Pine Gap, out past Alice Springs. Because you take out Pine Gap, you take out Uncle Spam's ability to communicate with the satellites, which give oversight of everywhere from Cape Town to Iraq, Afghanistan, Vladivostok, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all of China. That's what Commander-in-Chief Pacific uses to communicate with everything he's got in that entire fucking area. If Vladimir's going to nuke Uncle Spam, Pine Gap's going to cop a bomb in the first wave. And that promises to be, here's cheers, my first chance to taste proper fallout on me breakfast since 1963, when I was 2. Because that was when Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors and duly appointed minions, were instructed to go out to Maralinga, to the southwest of here, upwind, and conduct a series of atom bomb tests. And they'd tested just about every other thing they wanted to learn about their atom bombs, but they didn't know what might happen if you get 2 warheads from, say, a missile exploding at the same time that a warhead or inside a bomb dropped from an aeroplane is about to explode. What will the electromagnetic pulse of the first bomb do to the firing circuits of the second bomb? And assuming that the wedges of explosive, which create a spherical shock wave to compress the pit of plutonium to critical density, supercritical density, and cause the thing to fission. What if those explosives are not set off in the perfect sequence? What if you almost get to criticality and then the explosives blow the almost critical plutonium into a cloud of fragments and scatter it into the upper atmosphere and chuck it all over the ground, so that for the next 20 or 30 years, every time you get a thermal bubble breaking off, you get plutonium dust sucked up by the willy willy, put into the upper atmosphere and blown over to the eastern states. Anyway, that was the question that Queen Elizabeth's Raffy Chappies wanted to answer for her. And that's when they did it, 1963. Plutonium on the porridge for breakfast. Because, it's just such a good deal being a domino, a subject in a Commonwealth dominion, where Queen Elizabeth has dominion over all of her realms in the far-flung, what used to be the Empire. She'll keep us safe from the communists. How does she keep us safe from the communists? By bombing Australia with bloody atom bombs. Even setting off atom bombs specially contrived so they don't go off cleanly. That's how she kept us safe from communists in 1963. Rule Britannia, eh? Marmalade and jam. Prosperity for Britons in Britain. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole. Because who invented gunpowder? It wasn't anybody in Europe. Chinese crackers. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole. Bang, 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 bang. Yeah, that's what we used to sing as a patriotic song during the 1960s before they banned Cracker Night. These are very interesting times we be living through. I expected NATO and the Warsaw Pact to nuke each other in about August 1984, because I read it in a book, a very well written and knowledgeable book written by 3 retired Air Chief Marshals, 3 retired generals and 3 retired admirals, all of whom worked in NATO. When they got out of the Keen Green Brigade or the Blue Brigade, whatever they were, they decided to collaborate and come up with a fiction book explaining why they thought there would be no strategic, military or political reason for the Warsaw Pact not to get into a nuclear war with NATO. And they figured it would probably happen about the middle of 1984. And they published the book about 1979 or 80. I remember reading it in 1980, and I admit it, I took it to heart. It was like, I can't argue with any of that. It all seems to be roughly about right. So in 1984, having trained as a general nurse, so I'd have a useful skill, something I could swap after the apocalypse, I was actually quite surprised. And there I was, living outside, or actually I was living in, at that point, a little village of 600 people in the hinterland, waiting for the Mad Max times to come, and they just didn't bloody come. Instead of that, we kept growing the economy, burning more fossil fuel, increasing the amount of fossil fuel we burnt every year. Last time we had proper snow here was 1984. 3 foot of snow lay on the ground for a week. Used to happen every 10 years. Didn't happen in 1994. Didn't happen in 2004. Pretty sure it's not going to happen in another 2 years' time either. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1.2 degrees. That's about 8 or 9% on what used to be a 13.5 degree average. Just imagine getting out there in your car, cruising along, doing the speed limit, everything's fine, and just add 8.5% more throttle and see where you go and how you go, and see how you get around the bend at the end of the straight when you've just been roaring along, pouring on more and more and more fuel to the fire. And because it takes 25 years for a cubic metre of carbon dioxide to finish achieving 95% of the warming that it's going to achieve, 25 years, it means that these floods that are wiping out Lismore, 9 people drowned in the roof space of their own house. The floodwaters came up so fast they couldn't get out the door, so they stood up on chairs and they went into through the manhole into the ceiling. And it's cyclone country, so the roofs are cyclone proof. And with a house full of water, they couldn't kick their way out through the bloody tin on the roof, and they drowned when the roof went underwater. 9 of them. That was a month ago. The survivors went back in and just started mopping it all up, and it happened again, only instead of 14 metres, I think the next one was about 12. The previous all-time record was 11.5 metres, and that was like 10, 12 years ago. This weather that we're having now, it is a result of the warming caused by all of the fossil carbon that humanity dug out of the ground between 1750 and 1997. The LP gas that I burnt in my car driving around the landscape trying to cure the world with books of poetry printed on recycled paper, the carbon dioxide that come out my tailpipe, that is what has warmed the atmosphere to create the weather that is pounding the shit out of the economy, frightening crap out of the politicians, and driving all sorts of people to embrace the idea of having one final war to cure all the world's ills. And okay, they will achieve it, but the way they'll achieve it is by crashing the economy globally. That's what's going to come out of this. Have a big enough conventional war that Russia's going to lose, and they will try to nuke NATO. Nuke NATO, NATO will nuke them. Then all of a sudden you've got no economic markets in Europe. Probably or North America as well. You know, Russia's got stuff that can hit continental USA. So China's got nowhere to sell anything to, so they have massive unemployment. They're also not able to import oil or gas to run their economy because it's all been nuked and blown away. Here in Australia, we're going to be kind of up shit creek because we use 6 boatloads, 6 tankers full of refined petroleum transport fuel per day. There are 47 boatloads permanently en route afloat on the ocean, bringing refined transport fuel to Australia. In the country, we've got 21 to 27 days supply at any one time, and that's counting everything in the storage tanks at the capital cities, offloaded from the boats, as well as everything that's in every service station all across the country in their underground tanks, and everything that's in every tanker truck to deliver it from the capital cities to the service stations. OECD says we should have 90 days worth of normal transport fuel use in government-owned storage. Australia's never met that obligation. A couple of years ago, people like me made such a stink that the politicians, having been battered over the head by OECD, they got Trumpy to promise that if Australia has a supply-side problem with refined transport fuel, we can use some of America's strategic petroleum reserve. But we don't have any refineries to turn crude oil into transport fuel. Oh, we've got 2 left in all of Australia, and they're on kind of government subsidy life support. Because it's so much cheaper to buy a boatload of refined transport fuel from Singapore or Venezuela or Kuwait or Qatar or Saudi Arabia or somewhere, so much cheaper to buy it ready refined by the boatload than it is to buy a boatload of crude oil, ship that to Australia and refine it in Australia to Australian standards. So that's why Australia has no, well, 2 remaining fuel refineries. But here's the other. Once upon a time, you would have said it was a nigger in the woodpile, but you're not allowed to say that anymore because the Americans can't cope with that word. The black sheep of the family, shall we call it? The fly in the ointment. The problem with the whole scheme is not only Australia has no refineries, we don't have any maritime oil tankers either. Australia doesn't have a maritime fleet. In America, there is a law that says any boat that takes cargo from one American port to another American port has to be American owned, and it has to be crewed by Americans. We don't have that, right? Australia has no maritime fleet. The Liberal National Party decided that it was much more efficient to use foreign shipping registered in flag of convenience countries so that we could have cheap shipping than it was for Australia to have any nationally owned shipping. So, yeah, it's going to be very interesting when NATO and Russia have a nuclear shit fight because we're part of ANZUS. And like I said, Pine Gap. And the Yanks fly through Amberley and Tyndall and Williamtown. So we could get counter force targeting that hits Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, Darwin, as well as Alice Springs. Yeah, fun times, interesting times, very interesting times. Been meaning to make this video for a while. Had a few other things going on. But anyway, I think I've more or less covered most of the salient points. In the long run, of course, as the good book says in the Book of Judgment, God judges against war. God judges against all war. God judges against war, whether it's offensive or defensive, preemptive or a war of conquest. God judges against everybody who takes part in warfare. Everybody who aids or abets warfare or makes it possible for warfare to continue to exist upon the earth. And it says in there in the Book of Judgment, the penalty for anybody who takes part, anybody who aids or abets, make army boots and sell them to the army, make it possible for warfare to exist on the earth, manufacture weapons, sell food to the army, do anything. It may even go as far as paying taxes to fund the Department of Defence to conduct a war. I'm not that good at theology or theological tax law. I can't tell you whether it goes that far. But the penalty is that anybody who aids, abets, or takes part in warfare gets, after they die, their spirit soul is stuck in the first and lowest heaven of the earth until all warfare ends upon the earth. And here we have Christians, Russian Orthodox, Catholics, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, all agreeing to go and fight each other over oil and wealth and money and traditional, national, patriotic, jingoistic fairy stories. Because somebody wants to be the emperor of the world before the oil runs out and global warming shuts down the whole economy, which is what's going to happen anyway. All I can say is the rest of the biosphere is going to be happy when humanity stops burning oil, stops burning coal, stops burning natural gas. The fact that no country in the world currently has an economy, a society, a culture, or an ecology which is capable of reverting back to pre-industrial, pre-fossil burning lifestyles, it means we are going to become a very rare species. If you have to use muscle power to find your food, your water, your shelter, and your clothing, as well as walk to the nearest other human that you can socialize with and think about breeding, I think you're going to be a fairly rare sort of a human. Because over half the population of the earth lives in cities that depend on grid power. I mean, this is about to come to a terrible bloody screeching halt. It's really irritating having to share the planet with 8 billion fucking idiots who've been ignoring everything that the pacifists and the greenies have been saying for 45 years that I've been paying attention. You know, I'm only 61. I'm only 61. But, you know, I can remember being a teenager and all the science made sense then. It still makes sense now. And the cretins and the morons who run the banks and the political parties, the businesses and the factories, they decided to manipulate the system and destroy the fucking ecosphere, destroy the biosphere, destroy the homeostasis mechanisms that keep the atmosphere running. It really is like that fairy story science fiction plot concerning an intergenerational starship where everything was foolproof, so the crew couldn't fiddle with anything. All they had to do was just live long and prosper and get on with raising their kids to live on the starship and not fuck anything up. And all of a sudden, a section of the crew went mad, and they decided what they wanted to do was chop down the air recyclers and dig up the food and water recyclers and burn the air recyclers to melt the food and water recyclers so they could make jewellery and sell that to each other and call themselves rich with the proceeds. Because that's what fucking happened. And the air recyclers are called the forests, and we chopped them all down so we could dig up the food and water recyclers, which is the land and the streams and the rivers, so we could melt the minerals and make the fucking jewellery. Look, see? We have shiny, shiny jewellery. Aren't we clever? And because God judges against war, it is not going to advance the situation at all whatsoever to go out there and try and smite the wicked, or, you know, I'll fucking teach them a lesson, run around with your baseball bat bashing all the dickheads on the head for doing the wrong thing, chopping their heads off, shooting them. None of that is going to make anything any better. I've long explained the ultimate end of it in terms that when the last two violently doubtful warrior atheists, perfectly stalking each other through the stinking remains of where the last supermarket used to trade, looking for the last can of dog food, when they pop up from behind diagonally opposite corners of the derelict freezer boxes and they head shoot each other, when the last two warriors are dead, that's when the meek shall inherit the earth and the pacifists and the vegetarians will come up out of their bunkers and basements like they're coming up in Ukraine now after the war and the fighting has moved away. And when there's no more warriors, everybody is given up fighting because they just fucking can't be bothered. It's all fucking bullshit. And it is all bullshit because here's a funny thing, 20 years after they stop shooting at each other, the veterans of all of the wars start getting in touch with each other. And at the 30-year mark, they start going back to the battlefields and having reunions. And at the 40-year mark, they start inviting their wives and their kids and their grandkids, and they have joint reunions. Before they all got too old for it, the veterans of the American 8th Army Air Force that was bombing Germany used to get together with the German Luftwaffe's Jagdwaffe veterans and Flak veterans. And they'd go on a joint riverboat cruise down the Rhine River and introduce their wives and children and grandchildren to the people that they were trying to kill when they were teenagers and in their early 20s. And they all come to the conclusion that it's all bullshit. Like the trench poet said in August 1918 before dying in a night trench raid in October 1918. And later on, should anyone ask why we died, tell them it was because our fathers lied. As Eric Maria Remarque said in All Quiet on the Western Front, don't blame us who fought the war. Take it up with our parents. Take it up with our teachers and preachers and policemen and clergymen and magazine editors and newspaper journalists. Take it up with our next door neighbours and everybody who raised us to think it was a good idea to go and stand in a muddy hole in the ground behind barbed wire and shoot at strangers for 4 years in the rain and the rats. and the poison gas. And just for light relief, get up and run uphill through the fucking machine guns and the artillery fire and try and capture the muddy hole in the ground 50 or 100 yards away for 4 years. The war to end all wars, the Great War. Yeah. It's not going to stop until all the warrior DNA has been turned into compost. And in that, we have another one of these funny little things that the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics in 1998 wrote a paper, Morbidity and Mortality in Vietnam Veterans and Their Children. And in 2000, they'd got so many responses from so many families of veterans of not Vietnam, veterans of Korea, people whose family were in Timor, veterans of World War II, people who'd gone to the Spanish Civil War and then gone and joined the Australian Army, and people who'd signed up to be shot at, signed up to shoot at other people, people who'd been civilians in combat areas. Anyway, according to the Department of Health and Welfare Statistics, fascinating tidbit is that military veterans and combat veterans, regardless of whether the military veterans were in combat, military veterans and combat veterans both have the same suicide death rate, twice that of the background population. So it's not actually going into combat that causes army veterans to commit suicide. It's making it through basic training, or it's something that happened in their lives before they joined the military. It means that later on they commit suicide at twice the rate. There's a self-selection process. Potential suicides are attracted to join the military. They want that rigid discipline. They want somebody to tell them, this is good, that's bad, do this and we'll pat you on the head, do that and we'll kick you up the arse. They want it nicely defined into rigid black and white, neat zones. But after they've been in combat, the children of combat veterans, those children have 3 times the suicide death rate of the background population, 3 times the death rate of their own age cohort whose parents were not in combat. So, as well as that, these children of combat veterans, they have 1.8 times the background death rate from accidents and 1.2 times the background death rate from illness, because they grow up in a war zone with the PTSD and the flashbacks and the trauma and the freakouts and all the rest of it. And they grow up with a parent who thinks that a sucking chest wound is nature's way of telling you to slow down. So they take risks, and they're attention seeking, wanting their parent to pay attention to them. So they take more risks, and then they hurt themselves, and then they don't get taken to the hospital because you got to be tough. Worse things happen at sea. You got to be tough. Yes, it's just been stoked again. So what that means is that the children of combat veterans, they have 4 times the suicide plus accident plus illness death rate of the children of people who are not combat veterans. It means the people who were hiding in the basement in Ukraine, they're going to come out of that freaked out, fucked up, quivering, traumatized, and their kids are going to suffer from it, and they're going to grow up to be unable to cope with the stresses of their life, and they'll probably bloody beat their kids and die early at a higher rate than the people who manage to stay out of combat. And eventually, finally, the meek will inherit the earth, because everybody who's violent enough to take part in the bullshit turns their own DNA to compost, or they get to bury their kids. I think that's how this long baseline selective breeding program to turn humanity into a peaceful race, thinly scattered all over the planet, I think that's how it operates. I think that's the mechanism, the modus operandi. I think that's what the clause about the meek shall inherit the earth is all about. If you really want your DNA to survive, try and teach your kids to steer clear of combat. Otherwise, they're just going to be fertilizer in the finish. And if you live in Europe, if you live near a military base, if you live near anything that you reckon Vladimir Vladimirovich Lilli Putin might consider worthwhile bombing, or if you think that his delivery systems may achieve a drop shot or a long round on, might be worth looking to your bomb shelter. Funny thing, I have one subscriber living in Britain who just before Russia invaded Ukraine, for the curiosity value, he bought himself a World War II vintage Anderson air raid shelter. So I actually know somebody on the other side of the world who has his own personal air raid shelter. Hopefully, he's put the thing together and it's in functional use, functional condition, because I think he might bloody well need it. Although whether the British have still got an air raid siren to tell him to go and huddle in it, that's a different question entirely. I don't think they have. I don't think they have. I think the politicians and the bean counters used all that money to build bigger and better football stadiums, because that's what matters. You ask any politician. That'll do, eh? Long enough rant? Long enough warble? Warbles on a lot. Sometimes warbles on entirely too much. We'll see how that one goes. Vladimir Vladimirovich Lilli Putin and his silly little war. Ciao. Arr.